Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of NHLN Opinion Plus, a weekly series airing every Friday. This is a space for our opinions where we talk about current events and questions that Latino community is curious about. Today, we are joined by Joelyn Drennan, Senior Program Director of New Hampshire's Children's Trust. Welcome, Joelyn. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Absolutely. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Very well. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we'll just dive in with a couple of questions. Any questions that you have before we begin?
Nope, I'm good. Let's get at it.
Absolutely. So the first question we wanted to start off is how has the pandemic impacted the work that you've been doing with child abuse and neglect prevention, as well as parental resources on these certain issues?
Um, so I think that the pandemic has actually shined a light on the work that we do in the prevention space and kind of broadly just demonstrates the value and the impact of investing in systems and like building systems and cultures that support all families. So before, basically supporting families before, a crisis comes around, like the pandemic was just a great example of that. Where if we had the systems in place that are universally support families prior to this happening, we would have been a lot better situated, I guess, to handle it.
Absolutely. So can you explain more on these certain systems? And you mentioned that the pandemic has shed light on the difficulties and the systematic issues that exist within the system. Is that more of assisting children that face these certain issues like child neglect, or more of systematic issues that are in terms of background and representation and socioeconomic status? Can you go a little bit more on what you were saying?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess just to clarify the work that the Children's Trust that we do. So our work in the prevention space is really about building systems and changing cultural norms around supporting all families and asking for help. Um, so it's not that we're not child protective services, but child abuse and neglect prevention is really the result of the work that we do. We're doing that by trying to push, policies, family-friendly policies, and educating providers, educating families, empowering parents and caregivers to be leaders in their own, of their own lives and their own communities, that they are the subject matter experts on themselves, their families, and their children. And so really from this kind of, I guess, intangible approach that we take to addressing child abuse and neglect prevention. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like you're more of like the educational portion of it, and
Mhm.
you are the result of child protective services and the education of child abuse and neglect.
Right. So yeah. So if we do our jobs right, and we're educating providers and community-based providers and anybody whose work touches children and families, then maybe we can put DCYF out of business one day. Like that's that's like our mission, our vision, and our goal. And so I'm thinking that the pandemic has really shined a light on the fact that when you think of the words you think of the words abuse and neglect, there is a connotation that's attached to that. There's a stigma. It's those bad families over there, and really what we're trying to promote is a philosophy. It's an approach that every family needs support, not regardless of what their background, socioeconomic status is, all that. Every family needs support. It should be universal, and this is something that we should adopt as a culture. Is that we just supporting families is just something we do. We don't do it as a result of a crisis. Does that
Oh, absolutely.
help?
Absolutely. That
Okay.
makes sense. That's the same issue with mental health resources, how when the pandemic hit, we realized, oh, the importance of mental health and the importance of how we read media. And it just so happens that with the pandemic, we've seen all those issues, but they've always existed. It just so happened that during the pandemic, we were able to see those more in light. So thank you so much for answering that. And with that, can you go into kind of the biggest challenges that you've been facing as an organization within this unique time period?
So I think as an agency, we were very fortunate to weather the pandemic with pretty minimal impact to our operations, and so, but what we were able to do as a result of kind of the the work from home and this, staying at home and everything is really dial up the support that we provide for community organizations. And so we work a lot with the New Hampshire's network of family resource centers. And they are direct service providers. And so we were able to take a lot of the kind of administrative and stress off of them so they could really focus on continuing to serve families and trying to pivot and then also protect so that they're continuing to serve the families that were existing, that they were already engaged with, but then the influx of families that came in that were needing supports and services that maybe they'd never seen before, or maybe the pandemic impacted families that maybe you wouldn't see normally showing up or typically showing up to ask for supports and services. But I think that kind of the pandemic kind of just more empowered us to do our jobs and do it better and pump out resources and just make sure that we were really supporting the boots on the ground and providing them the tools and resources that they needed. We just worked a lot harder.
Absolutely. So within within the pandemic, you mentioned that you've been working a lot harder with creating these resources and educating the public and with making them more accessible. Were they all within virtual settings, or did you still make the effort to make in-person events or in-person programs possible despite the given circumstances that we've been having?
So for the Children's Trust, a lot of our events are they are typically in person. So that we have fundraising events, we have a summit, and annual summit that we do that's an education for providers, and just a bunch of different fundraising events that we did have to kind of pivot and turn them into virtual services. And then the work that we do with the family resource centers, we were able to support them with pivoting to a virtual world, which actually in hindsight expanded their reach. So we were able to get them the technology that they needed to be able to reach families that were in need. And we were also in one of our programs, the kinship navigation program that we partner with the family resource centers to provide. They would typically be running like support groups and parent education groups in person. And so they had to pivot, and we were able to support them in creating virtual support groups. And so there's one particular curriculum in the kinship navigation program that is very popular. It's called Parenting a Second Time Around. And so we were able to support 16 different agencies to come together to each take kind of a section of that training and go statewide with it. So it wasn't just a support group that was happening in one agency. It was kinship and relative caregivers from across the state coming together, and then the statewide network of family resource centers coming together to facilitate it. So it was really, really cool what we were able to accomplish.
Absolutely. And kind of going off into the parenting a second time program, what were some of the results and the outputs that were a result of putting together that program and having it for several years?
I think that so for parenting a second time around, I think what is really kind of exciting about being able to bring that into a virtual format was that we were able to reach a lot more people, and so the outreach and impact was large because we were able to support kinship caregivers in their role in a pandemic, also being able to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of, like what were the needs that were coming out of what were the themes that were coming out of the caregivers? What were they seeing, experiencing? Were they having trouble with remote learning and, their fears for their own health? And what happens to me if, I wind up hospitalized and now the child that I'm responsible for, like what's going to happen to them? So I think it was a lot of unifying, and it was really empowering in that respect. And then it really got the word out about the kinship navigation program too. So where it would have been on the, really on the family resource centers in a typical world to kind of pound the pavement and do, person to person outreach. This was another platform that, just is one of those like kind of silver linings out of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Like it sounds like you're doing a great job with reaching out to all type of audiences, all type of backgrounds, and just showing the importance of these issues. So with that, I'm curious to understand, like, what are the type of obstacles that you see specifically within Latinx, Black, and communities of color face when trying to address these issues and trying to receive your resources?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that these communities are impacted by systems that are in existence and have been built without their input. And so that is, I think, just kind of very broad scope of, our work. And we do work at the systems level. So I see this, pretty up close. And I think that change is happening, but it's happening slowly. And it's because people really have outdated beliefs about diversity in New Hampshire. And so tend to kind of fall back on the thought that, well, we're predominantly a white state. So, so we don't really have to address issues of diversity when actually our population is becoming more and more diverse, every day. And so we need to kind of rise and meet the need, and do it in a way that is inclusive and ensure that everybody has a voice at the table.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with like following just like just like diversity and just diversity, do you see certain families face maybe some type of financial barrier with addressing their services, or maybe finances is a key issue that they face that contributes to child abuse and neglect? Can you speak more on like the financial portion of it, because finances really does go a long way with the way families are grown and put together?
For sure. Oh, yes, we can go down the rabbit hole on this one. So I will try to keep it my answer brief. So I think that there's been an acknowledgement that a lot of the calls that come in to DCYF, that are slated as neglect are more often a result of poverty. And so you don't want to penalize someone because of their socioeconomic status. And so there's the movement to kind of distinguish what's neglect, like what is neglect because of intent, and what is neglect as a result of poverty. And then once we can identify that, like those, and distinguish those two, I don't know what we want to call them, I guess, genres, then so really bringing in the supports for families and focusing resources and targeting services to support families coming out of to bring them out of poverty, so that we don't see those calls, and having a system flooded with calls that really, it was like, what, if you had actually just contacted your family resource center or had access to a concrete support, or we wouldn't have these calls. Does that make sense? So,
Yes,
yeah,
yes. So,
okay.
yes. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Jolene. So, with that, I would like to ask, do you have anything, any last minute requests or resources or anything that you'd like our audience to know before we depart?
Absolutely. So I would say that New Hampshire has a fantastic network of family resource centers that are open to all families. They have endless amounts of resources and services that are free. They're welcoming and accessible. And we just launched a program, more of a project kind of in response to the pandemic unwind. So as we're moving back to some version of normalcy, that there are families that are going to be experiencing kind of these benefits cliffs. So where you may have had increased, SNAP benefits or Medicaid benefits, that we have a workforce now in the family resource centers that will help, that can help families kind of just weather that storm and be prepared for when the federal state of emergency ends and those elevated benefits go away, that we can connect them with resources. So,
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking with us this week on NHLN Opinion Plus, Jolene.
yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And join us for another episode in 2 weeks. For more information about our discussion today, check out our web store at nhlaTinoNews.com. Follow us on Twitter at NHLatinoNews and our Instagram at NH_Latino News. I'm Brian Zapata with NHLN Opinion Plus, and we'll see you next time.